what is fascinating is you also elucidated or like exposed the fact that we weren't just watching genocidal war, right, in terms of Gaza and the 12-day war, but a rupture in empire, a moment where everything can be questioned on a certain level. And do you think there's something in that which we can hold on to as young people or people who are looking for alternatives?
Well, it depends on what we do. The young generation, a lot of history and its trajectory has to do with what actually end up people doing. So if we sit back and watch these things, no. I mean, empire has shown resilience and it has a lot of resources at its disposal. The intelligentsia is on their side. In fact, one of the problematic features, if we focus on the United States, for instance, of late capitalist, let's say, decline of empire is that the decision-making institutions of the United States have insulated themselves against public pressure from below.
Yeah, that's
Now,
true.
yeah, that's a negative thing from the perspective of, let's say, me, who wants to see changes, humane changes, wants to see empire dismantle. And I'm old enough to remember that when I was, let's say, your age, a lot of emphasis among activists, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist activists, was try to change public opinion. And the assumption there was if the public is aware or becomes more aware, then it can use its energies and pressures to change policy from above. Now, I think that assumption is pretty much nullified by events, because as the ability of activists and events in the world have led to changes in perceptions of the public, the decision makers and the elites have also insulated themselves further from the ability of the public to pressure them. So we are at this very odd moment that more and more people see the world the way you and I are seeing it, and including in the United States. But at the same time, they have much less ability to influence decision making because of the insulation of policy making from the above. And sometimes in the literature of political science, that's called like democracy deficiency, or some version of that terminology. So how do we deal with that? How are we supposed to go beyond raising awareness of the public and changing the institutions of power that make those decisions? Those are very critical questions that needs to be raised at this moment. And I don't see any other way you need to have disruptive protest movements, and disruptive in strategic sense. For instance, if you're dealing with genocide in Gaza, it doesn't make sense to produce 400,000 people demonstrating in Washington, D.C. in a weekend, and then they go back home. That doesn't apparently do much. What you need to do is, like, for instance, get certain segments of the labor movement, let's say, to align itself with this anti-genocide policy and have, let's say, workers in ports refuse to deal with ships that carry materials to Israel, either to take materials off the ship or put on the ship. If you could,
general strikes and those sort of things.
General strike would be great, but even like refusal of labor to participate in ports to deal with a war situation or a genocide in Gaza or something, those are like the critical strategic nodes that disruptions would make great amount of sense. And from the capitalist perspective, if you hit them hard in their pocket, which is like disruption of commerce and disruption of accumulation of capital here and there, those are the kind of things that I think we need to participate now or think about in order to get beyond this insulation of decision makers from public pressure that's exerted in traditional forms of protest.
You've also written about the U.S. not being a republic, let alone a democracy. You've called it a rogue state led by a depraved ruling class and aided by fully subservient intelligentsia.
Mm-hmm.
What is the nature of the American state and, in its relation to Israel? Like, how do you view it in terms of imperialism and those things?
Well, yeah, first of all, I mean, a republic, the idea of a republic, there's two different things. There's a republic and democracy. And most people understand that the United States is not a democracy, even though in the statements of politicians and, pundits on TV or whatever, people always say American democracy. But everyone that studied history of the United States and Constitution of the United States knows that we are deliberately not a democracy. We're supposed to be a republic. And the idea of republic is such that somehow through, let's say, representational forms of politics and voting, the will of the public in some way gets to be influential in the decision of the decision makers. I mean, that's the idea of basically like republicanism in the United States. Now, I say United States is not a republic because you take, for instance, what is the most important decision that any political system faces? That's usually the question of war and peace.
Yeah.
And so you take that as an example and say, okay, in the question of war and peace, to what extent when the US engaged itself, let's say, in attacking Iran, last 2 weeks, did it engage in any kind of public deliberation about that decision? There was no public deliberation.
It did not.
Was there any kind of deliberation that took place in the Congress among the legislative branch of the United States about this attack on Iran? The answer is no, zero, zilch.
Zero.
Now, and who made the decision, therefore? The decision was made by few people in the executive branch of the United States, with possibly, from what we hear reports, agents of Israel and Zionist Israel debriefing the President of the United States with horrendously exaggerated, apparently, stories telling the President of the United States that if you don't attack Iran, don't join Israel in this war, Iran will be able to have nuclear weapons within a week and pass it to Yemenis, the Ansarullah, so-called Houthis. I mean, that's a kind of like stories that now we hear that took place in the closed doors of the executive branch between some Zionist, officials allowed there and talking with the few people who made decisions. So in what sense does that tell us that this is a republic? When the most important decision that it can make about war and peace is made by few people without any deliberation on the public or the representatives of the public in the Congress. So that's why I wrote that what is obvious to me, this is not a republic. And when you engage in a war of aggression against another country, unprovoked, Iran, never attacked the United States, really. There was no threat of Iran attacking the United States. In fact, Iran and the United States were engaging in a negotiation, the sixth round of which was about to begin 2 days before the United States gave green light to Israel to attack Iran. When a state acts this way, this is a textbook definition of being a rogue state. I mean, I'm just saying what is observed by, I think, by anyone, if observed by anyone, must be acknowledged without any kind of hesitation. Your other part of your question was, had to do with the United States and Zionism. But that relationship between the United States and Israel goes back in time, obviously, and we don't want to delve in all the details of history, but perhaps I should say that since 1967, when there was that so-called six-day war, Israel demonstrated to the United States that as a military power, it can decimate what the United States empire at that time in West Asia was very concerned about, and that was Nasserism, Egypt's Nasser. And Nasser represented the idea of unity of Arabs together, bringing in their material, natural resources and their intellectual and political resources together to create an Arab bloc, not unlike what you would see, for instance, in European Union, but that would bring this Arab bloc into modernity, to a situation of greater power in unity, and use the resources for Arab prosperity. The United States attempted to undo that for a decade and a half, and it wasn't really able to until Israel demonstrated that it can defeat it militarily. And once Nasserism was defeated by Israel, the United States realized that this alliance between the United States and Israel would be very strategic, that Israel can become a dependable and dependent military, let's say, branch of U.S. empire in West Asia. And it can be used against all forms of Arab nationalism that's independent of empire. So from 1967 till now, this is exactly the position that the United States had taken. So Israel is a component of U.S. empire. Of course, Zionism has its own agenda, independent of the United States. For instance, there might be differences between what certain segments of U.S. elites want to see in relation to Palestine. Maybe U.S. elites would be okay with, conquering of Palestinian territories, whereas Israel might not even want a neo-colonial relationship to Palestinians. It wants to see them erased in terms of like greater Israel. So there might be like differences between factions of U.S. imperialism and other factions of, hardcore Zionism. And we might see that in the future. But nevertheless, we won't see that there's a divorce between them, because post 67 Israel is a component of US empire, and its function is against any form of independence movement in West Asia.
Increasingly, there has been a growing debate amongst scholars of the left across the global south, such as people like Vijay Prashad, who have been arguing that this is part of a broader war on multipolarity, resisting US hegemony, including China and Russia. How do you situate the current circumstances in terms of Iran and Palestine in the broader geopolitical struggle over the global south and the future of the global order?
No, I agree with, actually, I do agree with Vijay Prashad on this. I do see that the BRICS Plus project is seen by United States decision makers or policymakers or strategists as hugely problematic in terms of maintenance of US hegemony going forward. And so they will do everything possible in order to create obstacles on the pathway of BRICS Plus becoming more powerful, and the de-dollarization movements and all that kind of stuff. And central to that is China. I think probably China is the strongest element of the BRICS Plus. First, because of its increasing economic prowess and development, which is, for everyone to see, no one can deny that China is a rising economic power. I don't think China wants to be seen as a, let's say, ideological or geostrategic challenge to the United States at the moment. It sees itself as a rising economic power, and it can expand its influence around the world by using the Belt and Road, for instance, policy and trade policies and stuff like that. But nevertheless, the United States, I think in the end, wants to isolate and prevent the development of Chinese economic rise to power. And Iran, I think in that situation, represents an important element of the BRICS, assuming that Saudi Arabia will not join BRICS anytime soon. So Iran and its energy resources are part of the BRICS. And I think by disrupting that, United States would be playing its game in disrupting the rise of the BRICS.
Vijay Prashad and his position that the conflict was part of a broader war on multipolarity, and you were discussing a little bit about the broader context of the war in terms of the larger geopolitical struggle over the global south and the future of the global order.
Yes. So are we on now? Should I answer?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I agree. I think multipolarity is a very important issue in terms of relationship to the U.S. hegemony that had been running the world for a while. And from the U.S. perspective, I think they do see multipolarity as something that they need to disrupt as a process, challenge. And to them, China is a key to be challenged and disrupted. China is a rising economic power and has the ability to not necessarily to provide the rest of the world with a model, although that is also there. There's a model that Chinese economic growth provides for the people, but the fact that Chinese, you might see from the United States perspective, tentacles of Chinese economic development are now global. It's a problem to the extent that China can make these deals with the rest of the world, economic deals, trade, and all, otherwise. That means the U.S. interest, economic interest, is becoming more and more limited. From a capitalist perspective, this multipolarity and Chinese rise to power and BRICS Plus may represent disruption of certain capital accumulation processes that the US capital is involved in, and certainly they don't want to see that. So, this pivot to Asia that was explicitly stated by Obama's administration and Clinton at that time in 2011 turns us tells us certainly that that is what the U.S. is concerned about. Of course, since then the U.S. have been entangled in NATO war against, in a European context against, Russia, and then now in West Asia with Iran and Israel. These are entanglements that you could see them either as separate from this interest about BRICS Plus and multipolarity, or maybe as integral part of it. So some people argue that maybe the NATO-US war against Russia using Ukraine is part and parcel of weakening the BRICS, because Russia is obviously an important part of the BRICS Plus. And uh, they thought once they weaken Russia, they can move on to China. Beyond that, obviously, that hasn't happened because Russia hasn't been really weakened and is the victor of the Ukraine war, from what I can see. So that didn't work. And the situation with West Asia and Iran could be seen in that integrated way as well, because um, Iran's resources, natural resources, oil and gas, are central to the BRICS Plus. If Iran is a full member, let's say, of BRICS Plus, so disrupting that, changing that, maybe regime change or regime behavior change or regime chaos or breakup of Iran would mean that Iran exits the BRIC Plus. And that's another way of weakening the BRICS Plus. So this is beyond like the Zionist, let's say, goals vis-a-vis Iran. This is the Washington's goals vis-a-vis Iran. So there are those layered differences. Yeah, so I agree. We should be able to see these conflicts in light of the decline or the challenges to U.S. hegemony by this sort of multipolarity. And of course, one last comment about multipolarity. I would like to see this BRICS Plus challenge capitalist ways of organizing the global economy, rather than just creating a room for these states to play a different kind of a game, or sit at a table with the US and sort of reduce US hegemony by forcing it to accept different voices. That's a different kind of multipolarity that I like to see. I like to see an anti-capitalist multipolarity, and not just a multipolarity that aims to have a space at the table, a chair at the table. So that's what I would say.